Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm making a State of the Class video about Protection Paladin. So first things first, thank you to everyone who left a comment saying they enjoyed the other videos. I read every single one of them, and it was very nice to receive so much positive feedback. It really felt good, and like I said, it literally did motivate me to make more in this series, so I'm going to take some of the feedback and no more preamble, jump right into this one. Protection Paladin, the best tank in Warcraft history. Probably. That's a pretty lofty claim, I realize, and, the act of actually making a convincing case throughout the course of a video that that's true is probably impossible. Realistically, this game changes so much over time that it's not really doable to say that any one thing is truly the best forever. Class balance changes every few months after all, but I think Paladin has the most complete package, the most unique utility, and the best implementation of everything that makes a tank special. I think if any tank could be the recipient of that medal, best tank in the history of the game, it probably is Paladin. So in working on this series, I've tried to think of questions about each of the tanks that gives a good context of what I think they do well, what's appealing and interesting about them, and then also gives a fair representation of their downsides too. So the questions I came up with for Paladin are this. If I were an inexperienced tank, maybe I'm new to the game, maybe I just am new to tanking, doesn't matter. Which tank should I play? What's the right tank if I want to be consistently good at everything on just one character? And the answer to both of those questions is Paladin. I think that's pretty easy to say. Every tank has upsides and downsides, that's not some big revelation, but Paladin is consistently popular and strong, and it has been for as long as I can possibly remember. Maybe the most interesting thing about Paladin is that it's a very, very strong tank, but it's also part healer. It has everything you could want from a tank, but you're not paying a hybrid tax or anything to get it. You basically are getting 50% of the toolkit of a dedicated healer in addition to the full toolkit of a very good tank. Now, I've played a lot of Paladin over the years. It's not generally my main, but I have progression rated on it in the past. I've climbed over 3k in some Mythic Plus seasons, I killed Mythic Sarkarath and all of Mythic Aberrus, and just generally I've played it a ton over the years, and it absolutely is my favorite tank to play in Mythic Plus with Pugs. You might be wondering what the footage I've been putting on screen here is. It is Raider.io's aggregation of tank popularity in Mythic Plus from season to season, and I've just been going all the way back to Legion, and then eventually that data gets very limited, and like some of the max level keys that people were running in some of those Legion seasons are like 13s or something. In general, what we're looking at are either 20s and up or 15s and up, since the number for what constitutes a high-level key changes a bit from season to season, especially as we go back to BFA, and I'm not trying to look at the absolute peak of key pushing, because that is such a small and very highly optimized sample set. I'm just trying to get, like, the people who at least have a chance on their gear and have some sense of what they're doing. Like, what are most of the people playing at a level where they would say, oh, I'm a high level player, what are they playing? And I think as we're positioned right now, 20 plus and up, that's pretty good. Some of the past seasons, maybe it's more like 15 and up. There are ups and downs over the seasons. Every tank gets their chance to shine eventually. I feel like Warrior and Monk are probably the two tanks that shine the least, but I think the data is very clear. Paladins have consistently been the most popular tank in the game for a really long time. This extends even into the distant past, too. In Classic Wrath of the Lich King, Paladin is the consensus strongest tank in the game, #1 on the tier list. No one would argue. I remember that being the case way back when I was playing regular Wrath of the Lich King for real, and I loved my Paladin then, too. I very much a tourist when it comes to the classic World of Warcraft scene, and even I leveled and played a Protection Paladin and absolutely enjoyed the hell out of it. Now, this is only a measure of popularity in Mythic Plus. This isn't including rating at all. Way more people engage with Mythic Plus than rating, so, I think especially in the current format of normal, heroic, and mythic rating, I think that Mythic Plus is a more accurate indicator of what the majority of the player base is doing, and Raider.io's historical data aggregation is a lot more useful and robust than Warcraft Logs' data, which only tracks the past 2 weeks of logs for a given patch, and that's fine. I think mainly looking at Mythic Plus is more useful here. We can see from Warcraft blogs that Paladins were the most popular tank in raids in Season 2. I remember from progression rating that basically every guild had some sort of, a prop pally in Avarice, just like they did in Sanctum of Domination. Like, pallies have had their heyday a couple of times in the last few expansions. And here in Season 2, that continued until a few months into patch 10.1.5, when the buffs to Bear Druid and Brewmaster Monk and Blood DK eventually caused the people who play a lot of tanks to realize, like, oh, actually, no, those classes are all better than Pally and Avarice right now, maybe. And Pally's popularity has declined a little bit for farm, but it's still one of the more popular tanks in raids. It's just not the, dominant number one like it was at the start of the patch. So why is Paladin so good? I think if I had to pin it down to a simple answer, it's just Avenger's Shield. Avenger's Shield works as both an interrupt and a blanket silence, which is just fantastic for control over caster mobs. And because its cooldown resets so often as part of your rotation and tanking, it can provide more interrupts than any class in the game. Just that one spell. You also have Rebuke, a regular interrupt, and you have Hammer of Justice, a stun, but just on its own, Avenger's Shield allows a protection paladin to banish caster mobs to the Shadow Realm. Like, I generally think of Mythic Plus in the mid-teens to low 20s as sort of a relatable range that most people who care about the game and look at guides to improve themselves tend to play at. I usually play around that range too, and I basically always play with pugs, so interrupts are inconsistent. Sometimes they're great, sometimes they're not happening at all. Prop Paladin removes that issue entirely, and interrupts are a big issue. If they're not happening in a lot of dungeons, you might just be wiping the whole time. If the rest of the group isn't interrupting, or maybe they're playing classes like Shadow Priest that really can't interrupt very well, it doesn't matter if you're on a pally, you have it covered. Avenger's Shield isn't just good because of its interrupt, though. It deals pretty good AoE damage as well, and grants a shield worth 60% of that damage thanks to Bulwark of Order. So it really is an all-purpose tool. Amazing for just demoralizing caster mobs, good damage snap threat tool, and a good defensive component as well. Pretty great. I think that my single favorite aspect of Prop Pally is its ability to deal damage from range. You have Judgment, you have Avenger's Shield, and Hammer of Wrath. All of these have a 30-yard range, and that really sets Paladin apart from the other 5 tanks. Like, I'm gonna go off script here and say, like, my ideal tank in World of Warcraft, a class that doesn't exist, and I thought would be the 3rd spec for Evoker, is a straight-up ranged tank. Like, something equivalent to, like, a Toxic Rain Pathfinder from Path of Exile, where you are just attacking with a bow, you are a complete super tank, but you're able to hit everything from range. That is the, ideal tank for me. Doesn't exist, probably never will, doesn't even really make that much sense in the context of WoW, but man, what a great idea. But Pally's the closest thing that we have to that. Every other tank has some kind of ranged pulling tool, but nothing that compares to Pally's ability to use a huge amount of its toolkit from very far away. For example, Warrior has Heroic Throw. It can tag an enemy from 30 yards away, but it's a glorified auto attack. You can do most of your rotation from 30 yards away on a prop pally. Avenger's Shield hits up to 5 targets, and thanks to Tyr's Enforcer, each hit also deals a pulse of AoE damage. This is a fantastic Legion artifact trait that was carried forward into the Dragonflight talent revamp and really fixed one of Pally's biggest issues from the last couple of expansions, which was AoE damage. Without Tyr's Enforcer, you could throw an Avenger's Shield into a pack of, say, 8 enemies. Avenger's Shield would hit 5 of them, and then the other 3 would go sprint at your group's healer with a taste for blood. This is still better than a lot of tanks with only single target range tools like Heroic Throw or Chi Wave or something, where you tag one enemy and then you have to play goalie with the rest of the pack. But those other tanks tend to have snap AoE threat skills like Thunderclap or Keg Smash or Sigil of Flames. And Paladin's main AoE snap threat tool is Avenger's Shield. Thankfully, that issue from the past couple of expansions was fixed with the talent revamp. This is also a great strength for Paladins and raids because it means that when you're forced out of melee range by boss mechanics, which happens often, you're still able to generate resources and deal damage. Then you can use that to either keep your active mitigation up or to heal yourself. Most tanks in those situations are either only able to heal themselves with Expel Harm, Celestial Brew, or in the case of Blood DK and Demon Hunter, they can't really do anything at all and they just have to pray that they live. There are a lot of other good answers to the question, why is Paladin good? Pally has really versatile defenses and lots of defensive layers. It has high armor and high block chance to deal with auto attack damage. It can block spells, and it takes both reduced damage while standing in Consecration and even further reduced damage over time while standing in Consecration. Because of this, Pally doesn't suffer from the warrior problem of instantly exploding if all incoming damage is unblockable, in part because it can basically block all damage, but also because it has a lot of other layers of damage mitigation if it doesn't block. Now let's look at Paladin's defensive cooldowns. Pally has the best cooldown toolkit in the game, and I really don't think it's even close. It has Divine Shield and Final Stand, so you can just become damage immune to deal with Dangerous Pulse and Mythic Plus, or mechanics and raids that would kill another tank. And, you don't lose threat, you're able to maintain threat throughout the whole process. You also have Ardent Defender, an active cheat death effect, and Guardian of Ancient King's very basic shield wall. Eye of Tyr combines a pretty good defensive cooldown with a big AoE damage hit, which is good, and Avenging Wrath, your main offensive cooldown, can be bolstered to give you more crit, that's useful in raid, but in Mythic Plus it's more useful as Sentinel, which makes it grant a ton of extra health and damage reduction on top of the massive boost of damage and resource generation it already provides. And then there's the option of using Blessing of Spell Warding, which makes you immune to magic damage and doesn't set your threat to 0 like Blessing of Protection, so you can use it while tanking without any concerns. It prevents the application of magic debuffs, but doesn't remove them if they're already active, so you have to pre-cast it. It can be cast on other players, and that makes it extremely strong in raids, and high-level guilds often run Prot Pally specifically because of spell warding. In the past, it would replace Blessing of Protection, now they are separate keybinds, so that is a concern, but on the other hand, you're able to use one and then later in the fight use the other. It allows you to completely cheese a lot of mechanics that require group soaking and, some sort of sophisticated coordination. Somebody has a blast that has to be split soaked, you put Blessing of Spell Warding on them, and then they just run off and it doesn't do anything and everybody's fine. Pretty amazing. But wait, there's more. Paladin's toolkit has tons of cooldown reduction built into it, so you don't just have a multitude of powerful cooldowns, you have a multitude of powerful cooldowns that are up really often. You have talents like Resolute Defender and Righteous Protector that shave upwards of 30% off the cooldown of Ardent Defender, Avenging Wrath, Divine Shield, and Guardian of Ancient Kings, basically all of your important cooldowns. You have Uther's Counsel, which reduces the base cooldowns of Lay on Hands, Divine Shield, Blessings of Protection, and Spell Warding by 30% as well. And you also have Blessing of Sacrifice, which you can very easily reduce to a 1-minute cooldown. All of this combines to make a class that almost always has some sort of powerful cooldown available, and also has the ability to use a lot of powerful defensive cooldowns on other players. It's extremely powerful, and it makes Pallies good at pretty much everything. Having a massive utility toolkit is awesome. We can all agree. You can solve every problem, everybody loves having you around, and everything is great. Surely no one could find a reason to complain about this. You've got Blessing of Protection, Blessing of Spell Warding, Blessing of Sacrifice, Blessing of Freedom, Disease and Poison Dispel, Hammer of Justice, Blinding Light, Lay on Hands, Word of Glory, and a combat res, on top of a million interrupts through Avenger Shield. But you have to keybind all of that, and your rotational skills, and your cooldowns, and you have to dedicate the brain power to remembering all of those different skills exist. You probably want to put keybinds on mouse over macros or the built-in mouse over keybinding system so that you can cast all those utility spells onto your allies quickly. See, I told you I'd find a way to complain. I think the fundamental issue with Paladin is almost the exact opposite of Brewmaster Monk's biggest issue. Pally really doesn't have a huge toolkit in terms of offensive rotational skills. It's pretty compact. This makes playing Pally rotationally pretty easy. It's really not that hard to be good at it. The real complexity of the class comes in managing the massive collection of defensive cooldowns and group utility spells, and I see this as mostly positive. The only real issue is that it can be overwhelming for less experienced players. If you're coming in inexperienced, Pally's probably the class that can do everything and be the best choice for you long term, but it is a lot to learn. Once you have a handle on the entire toolkit though, it's all upside. You can provide a level of defensive group utility that no other tank has available at all. There's another downside too. Paladin has rotational friction with self-healing, and their self-healing in general is limited by design. Word of Glory, your main self-heal, is on the global cooldown. It costs 3 holy power, but you mainly spend holy power on Shield of the Righteous, and for every 3 Shield of the Righteous casts you put out, you get a free Word of Glory cast as well. Now, old guys like me remember when Word of Glory was off the global cooldown in Warlords of Draenor and miss those days, but in every other conceivable way, Pally is stronger now than it was then. I've gone through some of my logs and found one Mythic Neltharion kill in particular in which I only cast Word of Glory 1 time in the entire pull. Once. I didn't die. I never even really came close to dying other than the 1 time I had to use Word of Glory. That was the only time I fell below 50% health the entire pull. I just didn't need to heal for the other 6.5 minutes of a penultimate mythic raid boss. That's sort of the upside. You don't really have to spend a lot of time and resources on self-healing. The downside is that if you need a lot of self-healing, you don't really have the resources to spend doing that. You will need to be healed by external sources. Now, this isn't a huge problem in AoE. It's not a problem in Mythic Plus. You really do get most of the self-shielding you need from Avenger's Shield and Bulwark of Order, and you'll have Word of Glory available often enough to carry the tough spots most of the time. I really want to head this off at the pass because I foresee a comment or something that misinterprets what I'm saying. I cannot stress this enough. I really do not think Pally has any problems with self-healing in Mythic Plus. It is on the lower end among tanks, that's undeniable, but it is an intended design and not a glaring weakness. The only real gap in Pally's armor is in single target raid situations when you're under-geared, taking a lot of damage, and you need to self-heal a lot. You have a limited amount of self-heals that you can freely cast on yourself, and in that situation, dipping into the holy power that you need to fuel Shield of the Righteous to heal yourself instead is a recipe for death. In previous expansions, this was the big strike against paladins and raids. It's why people in high-level guilds would sit back in their chairs and say, "Oh, you can't play a Pally in Prague, you gotta run a DK or a monk." Even though Paladin has consistently been popular in raids for over a decade. If you got too greedy on a Pally in raid, you could die. This is true of every tank to some extent, but Pally's really pushed it to the limit. Especially in Shadowlands when Ashen Hallow as a Vintir Paladin did like enough damage to kill a planet. There were people fully optimizing for damage, doing insane amounts of damage with that, but really like living on the edge when it came to survival. I think this stigma has largely been washed away in Dragonflight by the fact that Pally has such a massive pool of defensive cooldowns. In most raid fights, it's possible to basically always have a major cooldown available, either ready to use if things get hairy or just active most of the time that you are tanking. And that basically solves the problem of limited self-healing. Now let's talk a bit more about Word of Glory. One of the cool things about WoG is that you can use it on other players. It's a really powerful spot heal when you don't need the healing yourself, but someone else in your party might. It doesn't heal you for a huge amount baseline, around 10% of your health or so depending on your gear level, but it scales its healing when you cast it on yourself based on your missing health. This reinforces the idea that you use it as a reactive emergency heal. You're not hitting it on cooldown like it's Death Strike or Spirit Bomb and getting an 80k overheal. That would be worthless. You press it when your health pool drops and then you get an emergency 300,000 point heal that you needed every single point of. This is great. Thanks to the talent Hand of the Protector, that increased healing based on missing health would also apply if you use it on other players, so you could throw out 300k heals onto your party members. In patch 10.0.5, in the middle of Season 1 of Dragonflight, Blizzard buffed both Paladins and nerfed Warriors, and this effectively slingshotted Pallies ahead of Warriors in Mythic Plus. Suddenly you had a tank that was pretty close to as tanky as Warrior had been for most of the season, had great cooldowns, tons of interrupts, and could bomb the party with free massive heals all the time. And what do you think happened next? Season 2 came and Blizzard nerfed Hand of the Protector to death. Word of Glory as a self-heal remained untouched, and you can still use it to heal party members. An 80k heal on a low health party member is still pretty good. It can save lives, but Hand of the Protector was nerfed from a 250% increase to Word of Glory used on other people as a spot heal, down to a 100% increase to Word of Glory as a spot heal. Going from hitting people with like 300k Words of Glory to 150k Words of Glory was enough to kill that as a talent. It's not unusable, but no one uses it. There are a ton of great talents competing with it in the tree, and an unbuffed Word of Glory tends to get the job done about as well as a Hand of the Protector Word of Glory, and so it's just not a good option as a talent anymore. This is fine. So Blizzard acted a second time and added a mana cost onto Word of Glory, a really big one too. Casting Word of Glory costs 10% of your total mana pool. Many of your other spells also cost a small amount of mana, so if you're trying to spam cast Word of Glory, like you're just building Holy Power, Word of Glory, that will make you run out of mana very quickly. Now, if you're only casting Word of Glory when it doesn't have Holy Power and you need healing, so the intended way to use it as a spell, you're never going to notice the mana cost. I've cleared Aberrus on Mythic, done tons of Mythic Plus since that change was made, and I haven't noticed it under normal circumstances. The only time that I really have is when I'm trying to play like I am an actual full-fledged healer. This was a change Blizzard had to iterate upon a few times to hit their target, but they seem to have gotten it all more or less sorted out, and I think it works as a solution to the Prot Pally problem. And that problem was that Prot Pallies were running Mythic Plus groups with 4 DPS and a Prot Pally, no healer, and just carrying all the healing requirements. I ran a lot of double Prot Pally Mythic Plus and Shadowlands myself, and we had the same basic approach. We do tons of damage, we do tons of healing, and because there's 2 of us, we can pull like absolute psychopaths and just AoE everything down really quickly before it has a chance to be dangerous. It was awesome, but it was also very clearly outside of the way Blizzard wants people to play, and healers were understandably upset. This was basically removing an entire sector of the player base from having a role in dungeons, and it also reflected really poorly on the instance and class designers as well. I mean, egg on their face. They made content that could be done without healers because one of the tanks was so strong it made them obsolete. That does seem like a problem. All right, I've spent all this time talking about Pally, and I haven't mentioned tier sets at all. Why? They're kind of boring. To be honest, they're not bad, but they're just not great either. They're just sort of there. The class shines brightly enough, and the tier sets are just like a little finishing touch, not the bonus that ties everything else together. I'll put the old tier bonus on the screen. What it does is just add a bit of extra damage onto your Avenger Shield and your Judgment crits. You also heal for 100% of that extra damage, so it's not a terrible bonus, but the Mythic Plus community has generally been pretty negative about it. It's kinda weak. Coming at this from a more raid-focused perspective, I really like how Judgment crits are able to trigger Grand Crusader. I can generally get more than 20 Judgment casts per minute in raids, so less than 3 seconds as an average cooldown. The base cooldown of Judgment is 4 seconds with a good amount of haste, and a lot of those Grand Crusader procs that fuel this cooldown reduction come from Hammer of the Righteous or being attacked, not from Judgment crits, so I wouldn't say that the tier set is responsible for all or even most of that cooldown reduction, but it helps a bit. So that's the Season 2 and Aberrus tier set. It gives about 5% more damage, 2,000 to 4,000 healing per second, and maybe half a second of cooldown reduction on Judgment on average. Now here's the new tier set bonus. I reviewed it when it was first added to the PTR. It was horrendous, but it has gotten some major retuning, and I think it is a lot better now. So let's just read through it. Here's the 2-piece. Judgment grants a stack of Sanctification, reducing your damage taken by 2% per stack. Upon reaching 5 stacks, your next cast of Consecration is empowered, increasing its damage and healing by 200% and its radius by 30%. Sanctification stacks are reset when your empowered Consecration ends. And then the 4-piece, while you're inside of an empowered Consecration, your abilities have a chance to deal 40% bonus damage or healing as fire. So let's just throw some numbers out real quickly from testing. First off, hitting 5 stacks of the Judgment buff takes about 15 to 20 seconds, depending on your Grand Crusader procs and your haste. I would say realistically a little closer to 15, about 17 seconds. Consecration lasts 14 seconds, so maybe you clip it or you have to move. More on that later. So we'll say 13 seconds, and that makes a nice, clean, round 30-second cycle of the empowered Consecration being down for 17, and then 13 seconds where it's up, rinse, repeat. That gives you about 40 to 45% uptime on the Consecration buff. So we'll make some conservative estimates and say Consecration's about 5% of your total damage in single target and about 10% in AoE. This bonus would boost your Consecration damage by about 80% in total, so that's about 4% more single target damage and 8% more AoE damage, which isn't bad. The 4-piece bonus has a 50% proc rate. A 50% proc that deals an extra 40% damage is more or less the same as just 20% more damage. 40% uptime on 20% more damage is more or less the same as 8% more damage. So all total, this is about 12 to 18% more damage, which is definitely an improvement over the previous set, which added about 5%. There's also the damage reduction, which stacks up to 10%, and during the Empowered Consecration, it stays at the full 10% the entire time. This means on average you're getting at least 6% damage reduction. This is all pretty good. My bare minimum for bonuses that do something is 5%. 5% more damage, 5% more healing, 5% more damage reduction. You can do less than that, many talents and item bonuses do, but in order to really feel that it's there, 5% is kind of the lowest amount before I just can't tell the difference anymore. This bonus comfortably clears that in terms of damage output and damage reduction, and that's pretty good. That being said, it has a couple of major downsides. First off, you can overwrite the Empowered Consecration by just recasting Consecration, which is very annoying. And second, you have to stay inside the Consecration in order to receive a benefit from it, because that's how Consecration works. And with that, let's move into our final section here and talk about Consecration. Consecration is both the great strength and weakness of Protection Paladin. Thanks to their mastery, it grants you about 15 to 20% damage reduction just by virtue of being inside it, and it effectively lets you block damage over time effects, giving you a chance equal to your block chance to reduce your damage taken from damage over time. This is on top of that base damage reduction, and it makes Paladins insanely tanky against damage over time effects. This is unique among tanks. No one else can do this. But also, you have to be inside the Consecration for this to work. This means if you have to move a few feet for one reason or another, you gotta recast Consecration. If you play other tanks, you may not even realize how often you move a few feet here and a few feet there. But once you start playing Paladin, you come to understand this happens all the time. There is no real benefit for the act of casting Consecration, like actually pressing the GCD. You create a 14-second pool on the ground, but you don't get any sort of upfront damage or healing event when you use it like you would with Immolation Aura or, a lot of other things like that, Breath of Fire. Because of that, every time you have to recast Consecration, you lose damage compared to using some other skill. And because you have to recast it every time you have to move, you lose damage. This is annoying. It is the single biggest problem with Paladins, and not only is the new tier set not doing really anything to alleviate it, it's shining a spotlight on just how much it sucks. That is very frustrating, and it's probably a part of why the new tier set bonus is tuned to be worth 3 times more damage than the last tier set bonus. It's inconvenient and kind of frustrating to use effectively, because Consecration is inconvenient and kind of frustrating to use effectively. So what's the solution here? For players right now, it's just to play through the annoyance. That's pretty much it. There have been a lot of good suggestions on how Blizzard can fix the Consecration issue. The most common one that I have heard is the idea of bringing back Glyph of the Consecrator from Warlords of Draenor. Now, Consecrator was a glyph that only existed in WoD back when you could glyph primary skills, but it was really awesome. It made Consecration follow you around the entire time, pulsing damage to nearby enemies. It was basically rushing Jadewind from Brewmaster monks, but Consecration, so rushing holy ground. The only real problem with that as a design is that the WoD version of Consecration had no defensive component. It was a damage skill. Being able to effortlessly permanently maintain a damage buff is fine. To do that with a buff as strong as the current version of Consecration without any kind of skill or awareness at all is very overpowered. There's really no other word for it. Imagine if Warrior's defensive stance didn't decrease your damage, but instead caused you to permanently pulse AoE damage. That would be the current version of Consecration with Glyph of the Consecrator back. Consecration would probably have to be nerfed in some way to compensate for that massive quality of life increase, or everyone would play Pally all the time. To be honest, I'd be willing to make that trade. I do value quality of life over raw power. Imagine a class that's very strong but difficult to play. It probably would suffer in popularity because of that complexity, despite being really, really strong. That's right, I found a way to talk about Brewmaster Monk in this Pally video. So I generally think it's better for a class to just be a little easier to play, even if it has to sacrifice some power to achieve that and still be balanced. I've seen some other suggestions as well that are maybe a bit more likely to get implemented by Blizzard, such as the effects of Consecration lasting for several seconds after you leave the circle. This could be something that they put in baseline, they could make it a talent. I think that idea is not bad. There's also the talent Consecrated Ground, which increases the area of Consecration by 15%, so it goes from an 8-yard radius to a 9-yard radius. Oh, wow, cool. Here's some footage of that. It's not very good. But like, okay, despite me being negative about it, this is a workable idea. It's not a terrible idea, the numbers are just bad. If this was a 50 or 100% increase to the size of Consecration, you know, if it just suddenly turned into this enormous circle, this talent would rock. Everyone would love it, and most of the issues with Pally's Consecration spamming habits would go away. So now let's talk about the tier set. Part of the problem with the tier set bonus is that you are limited to only one Consecration at a time. If the tier set's empowered Consecration superseded that limitation, or if it just gave you the buff for the next 14 seconds regardless of whether you recast Consecration, then I think this would be an excellent tier set. However, because you can overwrite the tier set by recasting Consecration early, and you have to stay within Consecration to maintain the effect of being in Consecration, and it's important enough to be in Consecration that you know, if you have to move after you've cast an empowered one, it's worth recasting again early. All of this just leaves a lot to be desired. One thing I didn't really mention is that the tier set slightly increases the area of the empowered Consecration, like 30% or so. It seems to be visually bugged at the point of my testing because I can't tell a difference at all. If they bumped that out to 100% or 200% increase, basically just made it the size of like an Olympic swimming pool, I think that would also work out great. And I think most people would be willing to lose some of the damage bonus to gain consistency on the effect. So all totaled, good set bonus on paper, pretty good set bonus on a training dummy. Pretty frustrating to use in the real world. I think Mythic Plus players are going to be generally more positive about this set than negative, and I think Raiders are going to be pretty sharply negative about it, despite all the good things it has going on numerically speaking. Okay, let's wrap up. I think Season 2 and Aberrus have shown that Paladin is a very, very strong tank that basically doesn't need a tier set bonus at all to be extremely competitive. In particular, in Mythic Plus pushing with less organized groups, I don't think any other tank is remotely close to Paladin in terms of overall power. There are tankier tanks, there are tanks that deal more damage, there are tanks that have other kinds of utility, but no tank has the control over caster mobs, the massive collection of offensive and defensive cooldowns, and the defensive group utility that Paladin does. No other tank is even in the same ballpark on that front. So even if their next tier set was truly awful, like when it was first implemented, just repugnant, I still think Paladin would be a top tier tank for the foreseeable future. And I don't think their tier set bonuses as they currently exist are really all that bad. They're okay. I'm not excited about them at all, but I think they're basically fine. There's also still the possibility that Blizzard does something to improve their quality of life or just the underlying Consecration issue in general. And I hope they do. I think that would be wonderful. And I mean, I love Paladin. It really is already one of my favorite tanks, definitely my favorite to play in Mythic Plus. And I think it's going to be slightly stronger in the future than it has been in the past and present when it was already one of the best tanks in the game. It's like they say, the rich get richer. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.